I'm Ian with Touratech, and this is the Touratech Plug Travel Dynamic Suspension Set. This set works on all of the water-cooled 1200 GSs and GS Adventures. We have them in adventure height, we have them in standard GS height, and we have them in a 2-inch low height. This suspension system is compatible on all of those bikes, and it fits all model years from 2013 through the current model year, including the current bikes that are available with the auto-leveling dynamic next generation suspensions. The reason that you want to upgrade to these shocks is because your bike came from the factory with a suspension system that was designed for a rider around 175 pounds with 15 to 30 pounds of luggage on his motorcycle. These shocks are custom sprung for your weight, for your passenger's weight, for your luggage, and the kind of riding that you're going to do. Beyond that, these are a much higher performance suspension system than what comes stock on your motorcycle. I'll go into more detail about it later, but the electronics in them respond much more quickly to the changes that the bike asks the shocks to make when doing that dynamic ride adjustment. And they have a broader range of adjustment built into them, so your comfort setting is more comfortable, your sport setting is a little bit more sporty. Let's talk about dynamic damping. Your 1200 GS or GSA has a dynamic suspension adjustment system where it's using information from wheel travel sensors, wheel speed sensors, traction control, gyroscopes, braking system, all sorts of information to change the ride of the motorcycle across very different terrains and different speeds. These shocks use a motorcycle-specific valve technology that responds to the changes that your motorcycle suggests much more quickly than the valves in the stock shocks. The stock shocks use kind of an older automotive style valve that requires a longer time to make a big adjustment to the damping quality. And so what that means is that your shock has already traveled through a good portion of its travel, meaning your motorcycle is off balance before the shock has a chance to firm up or loosen up the valving. The valves in these Touratech shocks are patented. They're a next generation technology that's motorcycle specific. It adjusts very quickly to the changes requested by the motorcycle to keep your ride balanced and keep the motorcycle level while you're crossing all kinds of different varied terrains at different speeds. Both the front and rear shock feature a oversized 46mm damping piston. This is much larger than the piston that's used in the stock BMW shock. What it does is it gives you a lot more surface area that allows a lot more oil to pass through the valve shims, so you have a lot more control over the movement of the shock, as well as more volume of oil to keep that whole oil charge cool when you're riding the bike really hard. Both of the Touratech front and rear shocks feature external reservoirs that are much larger than the stock BMW shock. The front shock is 30% larger in the reservoir than the BMW shock. The rear shock is 60% larger, so they have a much greater volume of oil. Again, this reduces the working load and thus reduces the working temperatures of the oil. Having an external reservoir on both the front and rear shocks also allows us to have adjustable high speed and low speed compression. This is manually adjustable, and that acts on the oil that is moving between the main shock body and the shock reservoir as the shock is compressing. What this allows you to do is fine-tune the ride of the motorcycle, both on the front and the rear, so that when you're hitting bumps, you can tune that in based on whether it's a square edge bump that you're hitting at a high speed, or if it's a G-out or some type of dip that you're riding through that you don't want the motorcycle to wallow as it comes out the other end. This is a much greater fine-tuning availability than you have with the stock suspension on your motorcycle. Floating pistons are really important to the performance of the shock in high load and high speed riding situations. The Touratech shocks feature a floating piston in their external reservoirs that separate the oil that's working hard, that's hot, from the nitrogen that keeps the oil under pressure so that it doesn't cavitate during compression and rebounding. Some shocks are what we call emulsion shocks, and what those are is they have They don't have any separating barrier between the oil and the nitrogen gas or just the atmosphere that they keep inside the shock body. And what happens with an emulsion shock is the harder you ride it, the oil gets hotter and it gets foamy as the oil mixes with the air or with the gases inside the shock. And what that does is the hotter the shock gets, the higher the pressure inside the shock gets, so those air bubbles change size, and that changes the viscosity of the oil. So with an emulsion style shock, the harder you ride it, the valving changes with temperature. So it's a very inconsistent experience that the damping tends to go away as you ride harder. We don't like that. Nobody likes that. The Touratech suspension all uses separated systems where in these shocks, for example, you have a floating piston, separates the gas from the nitrogen charge. This keeps the experience consistent, keeps the ride very high quality, damping under control with all sorts of different temperatures and loads. When you're looking for quality suspension components, you want to look at the materials that the parts are made out of. All of the bushings that we use on our Touratech shocks, here and here at the top and bottom of the shock absorber, are made out of stainless steel. These things are turned in a lathe and they fit really tight into the bushings that we use at the top of the shocks and the bottom of the shocks. The reason that you don't want to use aluminum here, granted aluminum is lighter, but adventure bikes are pretty heavy and aluminum is not nearly as strong as the stainless steel is. So if you think of the shock bolt squeezing these two sides together, when the suspension is loading the frame of the motorcycle, it wants to bend the bolt, and when the bolt is bending, the bolt is squeezing together on these bushings. An aluminum bushing, if it's not seated perfectly, can deform under those kind of loads. On an adventure bike, because we see such heavy loads, we always use stainless steel bushings here because they're so much stronger. The other thing that you notice is on this shock absorber, the bushings are much longer on one side than they are on the other. And that's because this shock is so much larger physically than the front shock that comes on the 1200GS and GS Adventure that we have to offset the shock body to the side so that it clears the frame of the motorcycle. Friction is one of the biggest killers of suspension performance. So in our shocks, we use a very special type of low friction seal. And the seal in a shock, it has a lot of work that it has to do because it has to slide up and down on a shaft that sometimes gets dirty, but it also needs to be able to handle pretty extreme pressures on the oil on the inside of the shock. Just resting, these shocks are under over 200 psi of pressure. So the way that they do that is the seal rides inside this seal head. The seal head slides up and down on the shaft of the shock, and it's made up of a few different components. This here is a dust seal. This is a pretty common seal. Below that is a Teflon coated bushing, and that holds the shaft stable inside the shock. And then behind that bushing is our special seals. And the seals use a very, very low friction rubber surface that's backed by a Teflon ring that actually helps support the seal. Because what'll happen under pressure is the rubber portion of the seal will get kind of smushed against the shock shaft and get pulled out of the shock, and that wears it prematurely, and that also increases friction a lot. But with that Teflon backing that supports all the way up to the lip of the seal, it holds the seal in the appropriate shape, holds it where it needs to be. That way it lasts longer and it doesn't stick on the shaft as it slides up and down. At the top of the seal head here, we just have an elastomer top-out bumper. That way, when you're jumping the bike and the suspension extends all the way, you don't get a hard metal-to-metal clang as the suspension tops all the way out. The shock body just tops right out here. So we were talking about shafts. This is a shock shaft from a disassembled shock. This is the seal head here, and you can see that the shock shaft is a very large diameter. That's 16 millimeters. And we use a very high carbon chromoly steel, so it's a very, very strong, oversized shaft. And again, that's because these shocks are made for adventure bikes. They see a lot of load, a lot of weight, and a lot of bumps going down gravel roads, traveling around the world. So we want to make sure that these things are built to last. Another material to look for in a quality suspension system is what the shock body is made out of. Touratech uses a cold-forged 6082 T6 aluminum that's then anodized inside and out. The anodized surface is a very hard surface finish, so the shock body doesn't wear like raw aluminum would. And the aluminum that they use is a very, very strong, very lightweight blend of aluminum, and it dissipates heat about 30% better than steel does. So shock bodies on a lot of original equipment that comes from the manufacturer is going to be made out of steel. It's cheaper, but it's heavier, and it doesn't dissipate heat as quickly. And as you know, heat is bad for suspension because it heats up the oil too quickly. You start to lose quality of the ride. So Touratech uses a very high quality aluminum. It's got an anodized surface on it so that it doesn't wear internally or externally. It's a very, very high quality piece of material to build a shock out of. Having the right springs for your weight and your riding style is one of the most important aspects of changing the shocks on your motorcycle. Here at Touratech, we stock a huge number of springs. We have a very big selection of different spring lengths and different spring rates, and we custom spring every single shock before it leaves our building to make sure that it's right for you. The spring is important because it sets the ride height of the motorcycle, and it also is important because a harder spring pushes back harder against shock compression. So somebody who rides off-road very aggressively is going to want a harder spring than somebody that rides on the pavement real easy and wants a smoother ride, even if they both weigh the same to start with. Along with the custom springs, these shocks feature an electronic preload adjuster, and that's on the rear shock only for these bikes. But the electronic preload adjuster, the Touratech unit is very different from the stock BMW one because the controller is separate. And the reason that we put the electronic control motor separate is because the unit itself on the shock absorber is much larger than the BMW version. The reason that we make this so much bigger is because it holds much more fluid and it has a much larger swept area. So the working pressures inside this unit are a whole heck of a lot lower than they are inside the BMW unit. This allows this thing to adjust preload more effectively while the motorcycle is riding. It doesn't have to wait for moments where the spring is under less pressure. And also it means that the seals in this have to work a lot less hard. So they are very, very, very unlikely to ever leak, no matter how far out you keep your preload set and what kind of terrain you're riding over. These preload adjusters also have 15 millimeters of travel, which is longer than you get on a stock shock and on most of the aftermarket shocks. The EPA, or electronic preload adjuster controller, has been recently updated so that it works with the dynamic adjustment auto leveling ride height bikes that are now available from BMW. So again, this is compatible with all the model years of the water-cooled 1200GS and GS Adventure, including the current auto ride leveling bikes. Touratech suspension system is equipped with the same plugs used on your BMW motorcycle from the factory for a simple plug-and-play installation. Lastly, and very importantly, a lot of folks overlook this when they're looking for suspension. Both of these shocks are fully serviceable, fully rebuildable. They can be rebuilt anywhere in the world by a Touratech suspension service center. We have all the parts to do it here in Seattle, and we can take a shock that's been literally around the world multiple times, like we've done for Helge Peterson on his bikes. We can rebuild it to factory new, ship it out for its next world travel. It's really important to be able to get these things fixed no matter where you are in the world, and you can do that with these shocks. So again, these are the Touratech Dynamic Plug and Travel Suspension System for the 1200GS water-cooled GS Adventure, Standard GS, and GS low suspension height. If you want to learn more about them, visit our website or give us a call and talk to one of our adventure experts.